Welcome to week 2 of Old Testament 102. We're going to continue our study today in the books of poetry. In our first study, we looked at the book of Job after doing a brief introduction to the books of poetry. And today we're going to give our attention to the next two books of poetry in the Old Testament, the books of Psalms and Proverbs. First of all, we'll give our attention to the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is obviously the largest book in the Bible. There's 150 Psalms that make up the book, and these different Psalms are organized into a vast number of verses, 2,461 verses and 43,743 words. Just a way of reference for the magnitude and the enormity of this particular compilation of Psalms. The book is actually rather unique. There are a variety of hymns that have been found from Egypt and Mesopotamia, but there's no comparable collection of songs, such as the book of Psalms, from biblical times. None have been found, at least, so we can assume that this particular book, which consists of 150 different psalms, is indeed unique among ancient literature. Let's give our attention for a few minutes to the purpose of Psalms. And as we give our attention to the purpose of Psalms, we can look at it in two different ways. First of all, we can consider the immediate purpose of the book of Psalms. It seems, as we read through these Psalms, that the intent of the author or the compiler of these different Psalms was to provide ancient worshipers a hymnal, which would be used as the medium of prayer and praise for the Old Testament saints. So it was a very important book consisting of 150 different Psalms or songs that would be used in the times of public and joint corporate worship. And yet they were also used for another purpose. The ultimate purpose was to reveal to all saints of all ages the appropriate ways to express our true faith as we go through life's various circumstances. And as we read through the Psalms, we see that the authors are dealing with life in a very real way, struggling with life just as we do today. And we'll see that as we continue our discussion. The background of the book of Psalms, I guess, is very difficult to really come up with a singular background because the Psalms cover a wide variety of circumstances as well as an extended period of time. In the early history of Israel, songs or hymns were used to celebrate God's victory over his enemies, the enemies of Israel. Moses and Miriam actually led the people in singing victory songs after God had blessed the people of Israel with victories over their enemies. Sometime later, Deborah, the prophetess, actually composed another hymn or another psalm to celebrate Israel's victory over their Canaanite oppressors. You can find this song in Judges chapter 5. Now, it's obvious from what I just said about Judges chapter 5 that not all Israelite psalms found their way into the book of Psalms. There are several different great hymns of the faith that are found in other places in the Old Testament. Just two examples from the prophetic books. In Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 7, we have the Song of the Vineyard. And then in the conclusion of Habakkuk, we find a great hymn that is composed obviously by Habakkuk to close his three-chapter prophecy on the greatness of God. According to the superscriptions in the book of Psalms, there are at least 7 different individuals who wrote Psalms, which are included in this particular book of the Bible. 73 are attributed to David, 10 to the sons of Korah, 12 to Asaph, and 2 to Solomon. Then we have 1 each that are attributed to Ethan, Heman, and Moses. And then 50 Psalms are anonymous. Now, probably a good portion of those were written by David, but again, they are anonymous, so there's no way of knowing if David wrote a good number of those or not, but it is assumed that probably David wrote a good number of those that are anonymous. What about the organization of the book of Psalms? The individual Psalms were written over a period of at least 850 years, extending from the time of Moses to the exile and even beyond the exile. So the Psalms that make up the Psalter, they came into existence over a long period of time. Now, another way of looking at the organization of the book of Psalms, we've got the Psalms of the sons of Korah, Psalms 42 through 49. We've got the Psalms of Asaph, 73 through 83. And we've got the Davidic groups of Psalms, Book 1, and we'll talk about the 5 different books of the Psalms in just a moment. But the Book 1 is attributed to David, as well as Psalms 138 through 145. Then other groups include the Songs of Ascents, 120 through 134, and the Hallelujah Psalms, 111 through 118 and 146 through 150. From the very earliest of times, the Psalms were grouped into 5 books. Now, where this fivefold division came into existence has never been completely determined. The earliest mention of this 5-book organization of the book of Psalms is in Hippolytus in about 8200. So a long time after the Psalms were put together in this compilation. They were actually organized around these 5 different books. At the end of these 5 books, at the end of each of these books, the editors who compiled the book of Psalms inserted doxologies and other indications that it was the termination of that particular collection of Psalms. And you can see one of these at chapter 72, verse 20, which is the end of book 1 in the Psalms. At least 7 technical designations for Psalm genres appear in the titles. First, we have the Hebrew word mitzmor. There are 57 of these psalms, and it's a song sung to the accompaniment of musical, specifically stringed instruments. The second designation is shir, and this is found in 27 of the psalms, and it seems to be a general term, again, for music, and perhaps specifically here for vocal music. The third term is maskil. There are 13 of these psalms, and it's a didactic or a contemplative psalm. Didactic means that it was given for instruction, for teaching on some particular aspect of the believer's life, or one that was given to just cause us to stop and think, to contemplate what the psalmist is saying. The fourth is the Hebrew word miktan. And there are 6 of these, and the exact meaning of this is uncertain. Perhaps it's a composition that was intended to record some memorable thought or something that stood out to the particular writer of these psalms. The fifth is tefillah. There's 5 of these, and these are specifically prayers that are offered to God. And number 6 is Tehillah, which is a song of praise. And again, there are 5 of this particular titles found in the book. And then 7, Shiggaion. There's only one of these found, and it's an irregular or wandering song. The book of Psalms, all the individual Psalms, can be classified in certain ways. And even though the Psalms can be classified in various ways, the following patterns seem to stand out when you read and give serious contemplation to the writing of the book of Psalms. Number 1, there's predictive Psalms. These some examples of predictive Psalms is 2, 16, 22, 45, and 110. And all of these are cited in the New Testament as being personally predictive of events in the life of Jesus. The second classification is praise hymns or hallelujah psalms, such as 146 through 150. And these are actually extolling certain attributes of God: wisdom, power, graciousness, so forth. The third classification is petition or supplication psalms. You'll find some examples of this in 6, 39, and 86. And it's actually the particular psalmist who is pouring out his heart before God, presenting his needs to God. Number 4, penitential psalms. We find these in 32, 38, 51, 102, 130, 143. And in these particular psalms, the psalmist is confessing his sin and pleading with God for reinstatement into the fellowship of God. Number 5, perceptive or didactic or wisdom psalms. Examples of these are 119 and 119. And these particular psalms discuss issues which sometimes cause perplexity or confusion in the mind of individuals who are contemplating the greatness of God and the vastness of the universe. Number 6 is profession or confession psalms. We see examples of these in 33, 103, and 107. And in these particular psalms, the psalmist is giving his convictions about the mighty works of God, so powerful testimonies to the wonderful works, the mighty works of God. Number 7 is patriotic or historic psalms. You'll find some examples of these in Psalm 78, 105, and 106. And in these psalms, there's a review of the history of Israel and their relationship between God and his people. Number 8 is pilgrimage psalms. Examples can be found in Psalms 120 through 134. And they're also referred to as the songs of ascent. And these were actually sung by worshipers as they made their way up the hill of Zion to celebrate and worship and praise God at the great festivals that were given to the people of God through Moses. And so we've got these songs of ascent as they made their way up the hill to the temple. And finally, we have imprecatory psalms. And we'll find examples of these in 120 through 134. And these are psalms in which the psalmist is actually making an appeal to God for God to pour out his wrath on the psalmist's enemies. Very interesting and very powerful and personal psalms. So those are the specific classifications of psalms that we can see very clearly as we study the psalms in detail. Now, one important aspect of the book of Psalms is the emphasis on Christology. If we regard the New Testament as the final authority of God, which we do, then the book of Psalms has to be regarded as one of the most Christological books in the entire Old Testament. And that's quite a heavy-duty statement when you consider the Christology of Isaiah specifically. But the book of Psalms gives us Christological portraits that are just beyond, really beyond belief, and unless you accept by faith, they are giving us detailed information about Jesus Christ. We've got 16 different Psalms that can be classified as personally messianic. Personally messianic. They are specifically pointing to and revealing information about Jesus Christ. In Psalm 2, we've got a psalm giving us information about the enthroned Son of God. And we see references to this in the New Testament, book of Acts, chapter 4, verses 25 through 27, and chapter 13, verse 33. Psalm 8 is a psalm relating information about the last Adam, and this is referenced in the New Testament in Hebrews 2:6. Psalm 16, a reference to the resurrection, again referenced in Acts 2:25 and 13:35. Psalm 22, graphic, specific information about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we see references to this in John 19:23 and Matthew 27:39. Psalm 40, before Bethlehem, Hebrews 10:5 and following. Psalm 45, Messiah's deity. And again, we can find this in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. Psalm 68, the Advent and Ascension. In Ephesians 4:8, you'll find a reference to this. In Psalm 69, the betrayer is punished. We see this in Acts 1:16, Matthew 23:38, and Matthew 27:34. In Psalm 72, the Messiah's reign. Now, there's no specific New Testament reference to this particular psalm, but this psalm is clearly implied throughout the New Testament. Number 10, Psalm 78, parable teller. And we see this in Matthew 13:34 and following. Psalm 11, number 11, Psalm 89, promise to David, Acts 13:34. Psalm 102, the eternality of Christ, Hebrews 1:10 and following. Psalm 109, judgment on Judas, Acts 1:16 and following. Psalm 110, the royal priesthood of Christ, Hebrews 1:8, 5, 6, and 10, 6, 20, 7, 17, and 21. Psalm 118, the rejected cornerstone, referenced in Matthew 21:9 and 42, and Acts 4:11. And finally, Psalm 132, another promise to David, seen in Acts 13:34. So there's no question about the Christological aspect of the book of Psalms. So many clear, specific, in detail references to the Messiah that were all fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So, hopefully you see from this brief discussion that the book of Psalms is a vitally important book in the Old Testament because of all the information it gives to us about Jesus, but also about the life of the believer and how the believer in Jesus Christ, for us in the New Testament era, faces certain circumstances and situations in life and how we should approach God in reference to those circumstances and situations. Now let's turn our attention to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs has its own special place in the Bible. Actually, when we consider the different aspects of the book of Proverbs, we see how very special this particular book really is. Let's give a consideration to some of these special aspects of the Proverbs. Unlike the law, Proverbs has nothing to say about sacrificial worship. Unlike the historical books of the Old Testament, Proverbs doesn't allude to Israel's past or its popular heroes. Unlike the prophetic books, Proverbs has nothing to say of Israel's fate, whether good or bad. Unlike the Psalms, this book has no devotional material. So what are we to glean from the book of Proverbs? Well, it's obvious as you read the book of Proverbs that prudent and moral behavior is the overreaching concern of the author or authors. It's actually God's how to do it manual. It gives us information and teaches us the skills of getting along sensibly in life while at the same time pleasing God. So, how do you do that? Well, the book of Proverbs gives us answers. The title of the book, found in its own inscription, is the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. First verse of the first chapter. This was probably the original title of the final edition of the book, even though there have been other suggestions that have been made through the ages. The term for proverb comes from a word that the root meaning or the root idea is parallel or similar. The term actually signifies, based on that definition, a description by way of comparison. So we have parallel or similar, and it is a description by way of comparison. So let's get into some of the specifics of the book of Proverbs. First of all, who wrote the Proverbs? The book itself testifies to several different authors. Now, invariably, it certainly is to be understood that the bulk of the material was composed by Solomon, who was Israel's wisest king. But again, the book does testify to several other authors as well. King Solomon's name is mentioned in the inscription, as we've already said, chapter 1, verse 1. And then it's also associated with two other major divisions of the book. Chapter 10, verse 1 through 22:16, and that makes up a bulk of the book, as well as the four chapters, 25:1 through 29:27. So Solomon's name is associated certainly with the bulk of all of the writing of the Proverbs. According to chapter 25 and verse 1 of Proverbs, there is a group of men that's referred to as the men of Hezekiah who contributed to the present form of the book of Proverbs. And then various sections of Proverbs are attributed in the text to writers other than King Solomon. Number 1, sayings of the wise. Chapter 22:17, chapter 24, verse 23. Now, the sayings of the wise attribute the Proverbs to, in this group, to men who were known as the wise. Now, these may have been Proverbs that were well known in Solomon's day, and perhaps that's the reason they were included in the overall compilation of the book of Proverbs. But there is the attribution to the wise. Now, who these were is unknown, but we do know from this inscription that it was someone other than Solomon. Then we have the Agur material. The text tells us that Agur is the son of Jacob, and he's only mentioned in chapter 30, verse 1. It's interesting that there's nothing else known of him except what can be deduced from this material, so we know very little about this individual other than the attribution that he is the author of this particular part of Proverbs. Then there's a reference, interestingly, to someone called the leech, based on the Hebrew of chapter 30, verse 15. Now, there are some who think that the term leech is a proper name of another wise man. So again, we have uncertainty on this particular author of this particular part of Proverbs. Then we have the Lemuel material in chapter 31, verses 1 through 9. And these sayings are actually relative to the way a king should behave. And again, as we said about Agur, there's really nothing known about King Lemuel. Finally, the anonymous poem in chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, is that beautiful, powerful acrostic poem on the virtuous woman. And there is no claim to authorship is made here. It's just an anonymous poem. Dating Proverbs is rather difficult, of course, because the material seems to cover a wide span of time, dating from the period of Solomon, and which would be around 950 BC. And then the final form of the book probably was not actually compiled until 700 BC. So we've got 250 years there at least covered in the dating of the Proverbs. Now, an interesting question about the book of Proverbs, and we'll see this same thing about the book of Ecclesiastes, is where does the authority of Proverbs arise? Well, we can say the same thing about Proverbs that we say about all other books of the Bible. The authority of the book of Proverbs derives ultimately from God. Biblical Proverbs, and that's the Proverbs to which we refer, are not only expressed deductions from daily experience, but also, and more importantly, from divine precepts, whether those divine precepts are actually expressed or clearly implied in the text. Now, that authority, the authority of God Himself behind the writing of the Proverbs, also lends itself to our understanding of the canonicity of the Proverbs. Proverbs were preserved and revered by the people of God for a couple of reasons. Number one, because of its connection with Solomon, who was considered the greatest and wisest king, but also because of his immense wisdom and his prophetic voice, because he had received divine revelation. But also because the Proverbs translate the principles of the law of Moses into very simple and memorable sayings. So what we have here is, again, a how to do it manual, how to live life according to the law of God. So the canonicity of this book was discussed by the Great Synagogue. Great Synagogue was an institution founded by Ezra, and so the canonicity of the book was settled by the Great Synagogue. Some have argued that John's doctrine of Logos, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Some argue that that doctrine is based, at least in part, on the personification of wisdom in Proverbs 8. And it's very interesting to read Proverbs chapter 8 in light of, or with the understanding of, the fact that this is perhaps a personification of wisdom in the sense of the Logos. Now, there are certainly things in Proverbs chapter 8 that would lead us to believe that it is not about Jesus Christ, about the Logos, but it is interesting to consider the very, very strong parallels between Proverbs 8 and John 1. Let's give our attention for just a few minutes now to the classification of Proverbs. The classifying of Proverbs is really very difficult because there's so many different subjects covered in this how-to manual. So the type proverb which is most common in the book is the two-line proverb, in which the second line builds upon the first in a variety of ways. Number one, repeating it in slightly different words. Number two, the second line contrasting the first line with an opposite point of view. Number three, amplifying the first line by the second line, or making a comparison with the first line. Now remember, we discussed in our last session the Hebrew method of parallelism. All four of these are different types of parallelism. And we see all four of these types in the book of Proverbs, where the second line is in some relation to the first line in the poem. Let's give our attention now to the purpose of Proverbs. There's practical teaching in the book of Proverbs. Again, we've already implied that in our statement that the book of Proverbs is a how-to-do-it manual. Well, Proverbs is seemingly preoccupied with certain antagonisms in the life of the individual. Obedience versus rebellion. Industry versus laziness. Prudence versus presumption. And there's so many other parallels that we could draw, so many different antagonisms that are dealt with in the book of Proverbs, which leads us to believe that it does give us very practical instruction. Some of the stated objectives of the book of Proverbs as we continue to consider the purpose of Proverbs. First, the author wanted his students to know two things. First, he wanted his students to know wisdom. Wisdom is an understanding of what God requires of man and what man owes to God. So, the author wanted his students to know wisdom. He also wanted his students to know instruction. Instruction is given for the purpose of correction, education, and moral training, but also for chastisement, to correct us and to punish us when we are going in a way that is contrary to the teaching of God. And then second, Solomon wants his students to receive the instruction of wisdom. In other words, the discipline full of insight, discernment, or thoughtfulness. The book of Proverbs, again, is this practical instruction manual on how to live life in a godly way and in a way that pleases and honors God. Third, the author intends his work to be helpful and instructional to vulnerable individuals. There's so many references in the book of Proverbs to the simple and the naive, to the susceptible, to the gullible, the young, all of those who are susceptible to being led astray. The author intends this work to be so very, very instrumental, instructional, and helpful to these types of individuals. Fourth, the author intends to challenge us, to challenge the wise as well as aid the simple and the young.